She walked into his store carrying a dead man's legacy on her back and enough raw talent to embarrass every trapper in the territory. And Silas Mercer nearly turned her away. In 1881, Redemption Hollow didn't welcome women who worked alone in the wilderness. It didn't welcome women who refused to ask for help, who skinned their own kills, who showed up unannounced with pelts so fine they made grown men go quiet with envy. But Evelyn Hartwell didn't come to be welcomed. She came to do business, and what happened next would change both of them in ways neither saw coming. If this story finds you wherever you are, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The Pelts arrived before she did. That was how Silas would remember it later, in the way a man replays the moments just before his life shifts direction. Not with drama, not with any sense that something significant was turning, just the ordinary memory of a Tuesday morning and the sound of something heavy being set down on his counter without ceremony. He'd been in the back room tallying a supply order when he heard it. Not a knock, not a hello. Just the solid, deliberate thud of a pack hitting wood, and then silence. He came out expecting a trapper. What he found was a woman standing with her back half turned to him, her attention on the shelves along the far wall where he kept his tools and hardware. She was studying them the way a person studies something they've priced in their head already and are deciding whether his number will match theirs. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, he guessed, taller than most women he knew, with the kind of posture that came not from instruction, but from years of carrying weight across uneven ground. Her coat was worn at both elbows, and her boots were trail boots, the real kind, not the decorative sort that women in town favored. There was a long scar along the back of her left hand, pale against her sun-weathered skin. The pack on his counter was wrapped in oilcloth, tied with 3 separate cords in a way that told him whoever packed it took the contents seriously. "You the owner?" she asked, still looking at the shelves. "I am," Silas said. He moved behind the counter, glancing at the pack. "Silas Mercer, can I help you?" She turned then. Her eyes were the particular gray of river water in October. Not cold exactly, but carrying something deep underneath the surface. She looked at him the way people look at a scale before they put anything on it, evaluating. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "I've got pelts, good ones. I'm told you move product to buyers in Harker's Crossing and east of that." "Told by who?" "Walt Pruitt. He said you were the only merchant in this stretch worth the ride." Silas had known Walt Pruitt for 6 years. Walt was not a man who gave compliments freely or recommended anyone he didn't trust, which meant this woman had earned something from him. That alone kept Silas from reaching for the polite dismissal he might have offered otherwise. "Let's see what you've got," he said. She untied the cords with practiced hands and folded back the oilcloth in sections, careful as a surgeon. What lay underneath stopped him cold. 7 pelts. Beaver, 2 mink, 1 otter, and 3 fox. But it wasn't the variety that struck him. It was the condition. He had handled hundreds of pelts over the years, had seen the full range from the sloppy work of men who treated skinning as an inconvenience to the careful preparation of serious trappers who understood that how you finished a pelt was half its value. These were among the finest he had ever seen on his own counter. The beaver especially. The fur was dense and even, brushed in the direction of growth. The hide scraped to a consistent thickness that told him whoever had done it hundreds of times and had learned where the blade should be without having to think about it anymore. No cuts, no thin patches. The stretching had been done on proper frames, not improvised rigs. He picked up one of the fox pelts and turned it over slowly. "These are your work," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "They are." He set it down. He had a policy against making assumptions he couldn't support, and the work in front of him was clear enough. "Who taught you preparation like this?" "My husband, before he died." She said it plainly, not asking for sympathy, just providing the relevant history. "He was the best trapper I ever saw. I learned from him for 11 years. When he passed, I kept going." "How long ago?" 4 years. Silas looked at the pelts again. In 4 years of working alone, she had refined what she'd been taught and pushed it further. He could see that in the consistency of the work. Not just skilled, but disciplined. The kind of discipline that comes from doing something over and over with nobody watching and choosing to do it right anyway. "I can move these," he said. "All 7. I've got a buyer in Harker's Crossing who pays top rate for quality like this, and another contact in Millfield who deals directly with Eastern manufacturers, you'd get a better return than a general buyer would give you. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, more like the careful lowering of a guard she'd been holding up in anticipation of a fight. What's your cut? 15% for brokering, that's my standard. She was quiet for a moment, calculating. And you don't mark up what I don't know about? No, he said. I keep records. You can see every transaction. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, Mercer, she said. Let's do business. Versis. Redemption Hollow. In 1881 was a town that knew what it was and was not entirely happy about it. It had been settled a decade earlier by a mixture of homesteaders, failed miners, and the particular type of stubborn optimist who sees a creek and a flat stretch of ground and decides to start over. The main street ran north to south with the practical grimness of a place that had no interest in being picturesque. A general store, a feed supplier, a blacksmith, a small hotel that doubled as a saloon after 6 in the evening, a doctor who was also the dentist, and Silas Mercer's trading post at the north end, which served as the settlement's primary connection to the larger commerce moving through the territory. Silas had come to Redemption Hollow 8 years earlier with a wagon, a modest amount of capital, and the understanding that frontier towns needed supply lines more than they needed another homestead. He was 34 now, lean in the way of men who worked with their hands and forgot meals when they were busy, with brown hair going gray at the temples, in a manner that people described as quiet until they'd known him long enough to understand that what they'd mistaken for quiet was actually patience. He listened carefully. He kept his word. He had a sharp memory for numbers and a general distrust of anyone who promised more than they could demonstrate. He had built the trading post from a single room to a 4-room operation over 8 years, and he was proud of it in the undemonstrative way of people who believe that the work speaks clearly enough without commentary. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Clara, who had come west with him full of the same hope he'd carried, but the frontier had worn her down in ways he hadn't anticipated and hadn't known how to stop. She had gone back east 6 years ago, and the divorce had been handled through letters and lawyers, and they had parted without cruelty but without much warmth either. He thought of her sometimes, not with the sharp grief of loss, but with the duller ache of something that had simply not been strong enough for the terrain it was asked to cross. He had not been looking for anyone after that. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, been looking for much beyond the next season's inventory. The day after Evelyn Hartwell's visit, the talk had already started. Silas heard it from 2 different sources before noon. The first was Gabe Hollister, the blacksmith, who stopped in for a box of nails and mentioned, with the carefully casual tone of someone delivering information they consider important, that he'd seen a woman leave the trading post the previous morning with an empty pack. Trapper, Gabe said. That what she is? She does her own preparation and brings in pelts to sell, yes, Silas said. Gabe made the face he made when he was deciding whether to say something directly. He said it. Woman working out in the backcountry alone. Her husband know about that? She's widowed. Ah, a pause. Still. The second source was Frances Alcott, who ran the hotel and had the social information network of a telegraph station. She appeared in the early afternoon under the pretext of needing a spool of copper wire, which Silas happened to stock, and within 2 minutes had arrived at the point. I heard you bought furs from Evelyn Hartwell, she said. I agreed to broker them on commission, yes. She's been living out past Miller's Creek on her own for years. Doesn't come to town much. When she does, she doesn't... Frances considered her phrasing. She doesn't really fit in, Silas. I'm not saying anything against her. I just think you should know the kind of woman you're dealing with. The kind of woman, Silas said, who produces the finest pelts I've seen in 8 years of buying. Frances looked briefly startled, which wasn't an expression she wore often. Well, she said, I suppose that's one way to look at it. It's the relevant way, Silas said pleasantly. Will that be 1 spool or 2? Dear. He sent the pelts to Harker's Crossing with the next supply wagon and had a return figure within 10 days. When Evelyn came back, 3 weeks after her first visit, arriving again without warning in the early morning, he had the numbers ready. She came in carrying another pack, this one larger than the first. She set it on the counter and looked at him with that same evaluating look. You sold them, she said. All 7, at better than standard rate. He laid the ledger on the counter and turned it toward her, the columns showing the buyer's payment, his commission, and her net. He'd written it out clearly. She studied the ledger for a long moment. He watched her trace the figures with one finger, checking his arithmetic. He didn't say anything. "This is more than I expected," she said finally. "The quality commanded it. My buyer in Harker's Crossing has been dealing in pelts for 20 years, and he said, and I'm quoting him directly, that he hadn't seen beaver preparation like that since a man named Aldous Clay who worked the Northern Territories in the 60s. Something moved across her face. "Aldous Clay was my husband's teacher," she said. "Then the tradition holds," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her coat and produced a small leather pouch. Not a purse, but something she'd made herself. He could tell from the stitching. She set it on the counter. "For the wire and the stretcher hooks I took last time," she said. "I forgot to pay for them." He'd actually forgotten about the small items she'd taken. He checked the pouch. The amount was exact. "What's in the new pack?" he asked. She untied it. More pelts, yes, but also something else. 3 pieces of finished leather work. A belt, a knife sheath, and what appeared to be a saddlebag, one side only, unfinished. The work was extraordinary. The tooling on the belt was geometric, precise without being mechanical, with the slightly uneven quality of handwork done by someone with taste rather than someone following a template. "I've been making things," she said. "I don't just have the hides. I've got the skill to finish them. But I don't know if there's a market." Silas picked up the knife sheath and turned it over. The stitching was done with waxed thread, the holes punched at even intervals, the seams tight enough that you couldn't slip a piece of paper between them. "There's a market," he said, "a very good one. Are you able to produce these consistently?" "Depends on what consistently means." "Depends on the order," he said. "But yes, there's demand for finished leather goods of this quality. I have contacts in Millfield who supply to buyers further east. This kind of workmanship," he set the sheath down. "This is the kind of thing that travels." She looked at him with that expression again, the one that was measuring him for something he couldn't quite identify. "You keep saying that. What things are. What they're worth. Most people tell me what they think I should be doing instead." "Most people aren't your buyer," he said. "I am. The quality of the work tells me what I need to know. The rest isn't my business." The measuring expression changed to something slightly less guarded. Not warm exactly, but closer. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the market in Millfield." Chick. They talked for 2 hours that morning, longer than Silas had talked to anyone in a single sitting in recent memory. She asked sharp questions and didn't accept vague answers. When he gave her numbers, she worked through the implications before she responded. When she didn't understand something, she said so without embarrassment and waited for a real explanation rather than a simplified one. He learned some things about her in the course of the conversation. That she had come west from Ohio with her husband Thomas Hartwell in 1869 when she was 22. That Thomas had been a skilled trapper and had taught her everything he knew without hesitation, treating her as a partner rather than an assistant. That he had died of a fever in the winter of 1877, and that she had spent the following spring deciding whether to go back east or stay. "What made you stay?" Silas asked. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone's horse made a complaint about something. The morning light was coming through the east window at a low angle, catching the dust in the air. "The land," she said finally. "Thomas and I had put 4 years into learning that particular piece of ground, where the animals moved, what the seasons did, what to expect from the creek when it flooded. I'd earned that knowledge. Going back east would have meant leaving it behind, and I didn't see why I should have to." It was a completely practical answer, and Silas recognized in it the same pragmatic stubbornness that had kept him in Redemption Hollow through 2 hard winters and a supply crisis that had nearly broken the trading post. The refusal to surrender ground you'd paid for with your own effort. "That makes sense," he said. "Most people think it doesn't," she said. "Most people think a woman living alone in the backcountry is either reckless or sad. I'm neither." "I didn't say you were." "You didn't," she agreed. "That's why we've been talking for 2 hours. Deputy Harlan Cole was a tall man with an easy smile that he wore the way some men wear good boots, as a way of managing the first impression before anything else had to be decided. He had been appointed deputy of Redemption Hollow 3 years earlier by a sheriff who spent most of his time in the county seat and left Cole to manage the day-to-day. Cole was not a bad man in the dramatic sense. He didn't steal, didn't drink on duty, showed up when something needed showing up for. But he had a particular blind spot about women, which was that he understood them primarily as things that needed to be organized, rather than people with their own understanding of their own situations. He noticed Evelyn Hartwell on her second visit to town, noticed her the way he noticed anything that struck him as not quite right from his perspective. A horse tied on the wrong side of the street, a wagon parked where it was technically allowed but still inconvenient. She was a woman, she was alone, and she was moving through the world with a self-sufficiency that suggested she didn't think she needed any help from him. This bothered Cole more than he would have admitted if anyone had asked. He appeared at the trading post on the afternoon of Evelyn's second visit, just as she was finishing her conversation with Silas. He came in with a casual air and bought nothing, which was unusual for a man who generally had a reason for being wherever he was. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, touching his hat. "Good to see you in town." "Deputy," she said. Her voice was even. "You making the ride out from Miller's Creek alone?" "I always do." "That's a long way for a woman on her own. A lot of rough territory between here and there." He glanced at Silas, then back at her. "If you're making regular runs, might make sense to let someone know your schedule, in case of trouble." "I know the territory," Evelyn said. "I've been riding it for 11 years. Still, it doesn't hurt to— Thank you, Deputy," she said. It was not a thank you. It was a door closing. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Silas with an expression that invited Silas to add something, to offer some reasonable-sounding reinforcement of what Cole was suggesting. Silas was looking at the ledger on the counter. "She knows the territory," he said mildly. She said so. Cole left shortly after, and Evelyn watched the door for a moment after he was gone. "He does that every time," she said. "Does he cause actual trouble?" "Not yet," she said. "But he's the kind of man who thinks he's being helpful, which is sometimes worse." Silas thought about that. He had known men like that. Not malicious, just constitutionally unable to accept that their help hadn't been requested. "He'll get bored eventually," he said. "Men like that usually do when the woman in question refuses to seem distressed about it." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the slight narrowing of the eyes that meant she was reassessing something. "That's an interesting thing for a man to say," she said. "It's just what I've observed," he said. She picked up her empty pack and slung it over one shoulder. "I'll bring the finished saddlebag on my next run," she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Depends on the trapping. "I'll have the Millfield contacts in place by then," he said. She nodded once, the way people nod when they've made a decision and don't need to talk about it further, and walked out into the afternoon. Check. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Silas found himself noticing. Not that he was waiting for her visits. He told himself he wasn't, and he mostly believed it. But he found that his Tuesday mornings in particular carried a different quality than they had before. A slight orientation toward the north door of the shop. She came every 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes with pelts, sometimes with finished leatherwork, sometimes with both. Each time she brought something slightly different. A pair of gloves with tooled cuffs, a document satchel with brass fittings she'd sourced from a hardware catalog, a series of belts in different widths designed for specific uses. She was experimenting, he realized, using the work she was doing in the wilderness to supply raw material and using the market information he was giving her to guide what she made with her hands. Their conversations got longer. Not all at once. It wasn't like that. It was more like the way a trail gets easier the second time you walk it. She was still precise and unsentimental, still gave him the impression that her time was a specific resource she didn't waste, but she stopped ending conversations as quickly. She started asking questions that weren't strictly about business. "What do you know about vegetable tanning?" she asked one afternoon in early autumn, sitting on the stool she'd claimed for herself in the corner where the light from the east window reached. "Enough to know it produces a harder product than brain tanning," he said. "Better for certain applications." "Why?" "I've been reading about it. There are tanneries in the east that use it for commercial leather goods. The product holds tooling better, holds dye better." She paused. "If I could learn to do it properly, I could expand what I make. Better belts, better bags, maybe harnesses eventually." "Where would you learn it?" "That's the question." She looked at the wall where he kept his reference books. You have anything on it? He did, as it turned out, a technical manual on leather preparation that had come with a bulk book order 3 years earlier and had sat unread on the shelf because he'd never had a reason to read it. He found it and handed it to her, and she took it the way she took everything, as if she'd already decided to be useful with it. I'll return it next trip, she said. Keep it as long as you need it. She opened it to the table of contents. He watched her for a moment. The focused attention, the way she read the chapter titles as if she were already planning which ones she'd start with. You're going to figure it out, he said, not meaning to say it out loud. She looked up. What makes you say that? Because you always do, he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in a way he couldn't entirely read. Then she looked back at the book. Don't give me credit for things I haven't done yet, she said. But there was something different in her voice when she said it. But the letter started in October. It was practical. She needed information he could find in town, and he needed her guidance on how to describe the leatherwork to buyers who were asking technical questions. But the letters became something else over the course of several exchanges. He'd write with a buyer's specifications, and she'd write back not just with the answer, but with a description of what she was working on, what the mornings were like out past Miller's Creek, what the beaver population was doing that year. He started writing back about things that weren't strictly business. The situation with the supply wagon routes. A difficult negotiation with a buyer in Millfield that had made him genuinely angry, something he almost never wrote down. A book he'd been reading about the history of trade in the Western Territories. Her responses were terse in the way of someone who chose words with some care. Not elaborate, not formal, but precise. She wrote the way she talked, and sometimes at the end of a letter, after the business was handled, there would be a sentence or two that was just something she'd seen. The way the ice formed on the creek in early winter. A fox kit she'd watched for a morning before it moved on. He saved the letters. He didn't examine too closely why he was saving them. In the third week of November, Cole tried again. It was a Sunday, and Evelyn had come into town not for business, but to pick up supplies. Flour, salt, some dry goods she couldn't make herself. Cole caught her at the general store and managed to arrange it so that he was offering her a ride home with the supplies because he happened to be heading that direction. He wasn't heading that direction. Silas learned about it afterward from Evelyn herself, when she came to the trading post after extracting herself from the situation. She was not, he noted, visibly upset, more the precise, contained irritation of someone managing a recurring inconvenience. He offered to bring the supplies out to me, she said. Said it was no trouble. Kept mentioning how isolated the homestead is. What did you tell him? I told him I'd been managing the isolation fine for 4 years, and I'd let him know if that changed. She set her gloves on the counter. Then I loaded my own horse and came here. Here specifically? She looked at him. I needed to think somewhere that wasn't the middle of the street, she said. You don't talk when I don't want to talk. It was one of the more oblique compliments he'd received. Coffee's hot, he said. Kettle on the back stove. She got herself coffee without asking where the cups were. She'd learned the layout of the back room over the months, and came back and sat in her corner. He went back to the inventory he'd been doing. They stayed like that for a while, neither talking, and it was one of the most comfortable silences he could remember. He's not going to stop, she said eventually. Probably not for a while. I don't want to cause trouble for you. If he decides I'm trouble, that extends to Evelyn. She looked at him. I'm not worried about Cole. Our business is our business. If he's got opinions about it, that's for him to manage. She studied him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the street where the November light was going flat and gray. Thomas would have liked you, she said. It sounded like it surprised her slightly, saying it. Silas didn't know what to do with that, so he said the simplest thing. I would have liked to know him, he said, based on what you've told me. She nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside, the sky was turning the particular color of early winter, and somewhere on the street someone's wagon was leaving, the sound of hoofbeats fading north. December came in hard that year. A storm in the second week dropped enough snow to close the northern road for 4 days, and Silas found himself watching the weather with a specific anxiety he would have found difficult to explain to anyone who asked. He knew Evelyn had laid in supplies before the cold settled. She always planned carefully, But the homestead past Miller's Creek was 8 miles from the nearest neighbor, and 8 miles in 4 feet of snow was a different proposition than 8 miles in autumn. He wrote her a letter and held it for 3 days waiting for a rider heading in that direction. When the road cleared and the letter went out, he felt slightly foolish, because the letter contained nothing essential, just information about a new buyer contact he'd made, and at the end, a line asking if she'd come through the storm all right. Her response came back in 10 days. She had come through fine. The cellar was stocked. The animals were sheltered. She'd spent the 4 days of the worst of the storm doing repair work on her stretching frames and finishing a pair of custom boots she'd been working on. She described the silence of the snow with the same careful precision she used for everything. Not romantic about it, not complaining, just precise. The way it compressed sound, the particular quality of the light when the sky cleared. At the end of the letter, she had written, "I don't mind being asked if I'm all right, as long as it's an honest question and not a way of suggesting I shouldn't be out here." He read that sentence 4 times before he folded the letter and put it with the others. He wrote back, "It was an honest question." Her response to that was only 1 line. "I know, that's why I answered it." By the time spring came back to Redemption Hollow, something had shifted between them in a way that both of them were aware of and neither had named. It was in the way she arrived now, still without announcement, but with the ease of someone who knew where they were going. The way he had coffee ready on the back stove without having made a deliberate decision to do so. The way conversations moved between business and something else without a seam. The way she had started leaving small things at the trading post, the borrowed tanning manual, a pair of sample gloves for buyer reference, that gave her a reason to come back for them, or maybe just marked the space as somewhere that had some of her in it. He was careful about it. He was careful in the way of a man who has been wrong before about what he thought he understood, who has seen something not be strong enough for the terrain. But he was paying attention. She was paying attention too, though she showed it differently. In the questions she asked that went past business, in the way she listened to his answers as if she was filing them carefully, in the occasional moment when she'd say something and watch his face for a reaction before she decided whether she'd said the right thing. It was the spring of 1882, and neither of them was entirely sure what they were building, but both of them were building it. On a morning in late April, she brought in the completed saddlebag, both sides now, finished, with custom brass hardware and tooling that would have looked at home on a display shelf in an eastern city. She set it on the counter and stood back while he examined it. It was the finest piece of leatherwork he had seen from her, and he had seen a great deal. "This is going to get attention," he said. "Good attention or complicated attention?" "Both, probably." He looked up. "The kind that changes things." She met his gaze across the counter. "Things change whether you want them to or not," she said. "Might as well be in the direction you choose." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings did in that country. Uncertain, a little cold still, but with something underneath it that was unmistakably beginning. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The saddlebag sat between them on the counter, extraordinarily well made, ready to go further than either of them had gone yet. The saddlebag sold in 6 days. Silas had sent it to his contact in Millfield, a dry goods broker named Arthur Pennington, who supplied to 3 different mercantile chains and had been asking for quality leather goods for 2 seasons. Pennington's response came back faster than anything he'd sent before, a single page that was uncharacteristically enthusiastic for a man who typically wrote like he was billing by the word. "Finest finished piece I've handled in 2 years. Buyer in Cincinnati inquired same day. "Can you source more? Need to know quantity and lead time." Silas read the letter twice, then set it on the counter and looked at the space where the saddlebag had been. Then he wrote back to Pennington with a timeline he didn't entirely know how to fulfill yet, and wrote to Evelyn the same afternoon. She arrived 12 days later, which was faster than her usual schedule. She came in out of a May rainstorm, her coat dark with water, and dropped her pack on the floor instead of the counter because it was heavier than usual. She didn't apologize for dripping on the boards. "Your letter said urgent," she said. "Pennington wants to know if you can produce consistently. He's got a buyer in Cincinnati who saw the saddlebag and is asking about a standing order." She pushed her wet hair back from her face and looked at him with an expression that was not exactly surprise, more like someone who had been told a bet they made quietly to themselves had paid off. "Standing order for what?" He didn't specify. He wants to have the conversation first, which means he wants to meet you, or at least correspond directly. He's been corresponding with you. He wants the source, Silas said, not the broker. That's a good sign. It means he's thinking long term. She was quiet for a moment. She pulled off her wet coat and hung it on the peg by the door without asking if she could. He'd told her to use it weeks ago. How much could I realistically make in a month, she said, if I cut back on trapping and focused on finishing work? That depends on what he orders. But if he's talking Cincinnati buyers, we're talking volume that would take you well past what you're currently producing. I can't produce at volume and maintain quality, she said flatly. Anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't understand what goes into it. I know that. I'll tell him that. Don't tell him on my behalf, she said. Give me his address. I'll tell him myself. Silas looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. He wrote out Pennington's details and handed her the paper. She folded it into her shirt pocket with the decisive efficiency of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and just needed the information to do it. What else? She said. The Pelts from February sold. I've got your payment here. He slid the envelope across the counter. And a buyer in Harker's Crossing wants to know if you can source river otter in quantity this fall. He'll pay above market rate for anything in the condition of what you brought in January. She opened the envelope, checked the figure, and put it away. I'll know by August what the otter population is doing, she said. I don't promise what I can't see yet. I told him that. He said he'd wait. She nodded once. Then she sat down on her stool and looked out the window at the rain coming down in gray sheets on the main street. A wagon was trying to get through the mud and not doing well. Pennington, she said. What kind of man is he? Practical. Honest in his dealing, as far as I can tell. He doesn't pay more than he has to, but he pays what he says he will. He's been in the trade a long time. He won't have dealt with a woman directly before. Probably not. So he'll either be strange about it, or he'll pretend not to notice and just focus on the work. My guess is the second, Silas said. He's the kind of man who cares about product more than story. She considered that. Good. I don't have much interest in being a story. She paused. Although I suppose that's not entirely up to me anymore, is it? He didn't answer because there wasn't a useful answer. She was right. The quality of the work was going to draw attention, and attention had its own logic that didn't ask permission first. For what it's worth, he said, the kind of attention this work draws is the kind you can use. She looked at him. You're an optimist. I'm a merchant. Same thing, mostly. Something softened in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The closest she got, which he was starting to learn, wasn't nothing. Part 7. The letter she wrote to Pennington was 4 paragraphs long, and she showed it to Silas before she sent it, not for approval, but because she wanted a second read on the tone. He read it standing at the counter while she waited. It was direct to the point of being blunt. She explained her process in concrete terms, stated plainly what she could and couldn't produce, set out her terms for quality control, that no piece left her hands that she wasn't satisfied with, and that she'd rather produce less at standard than more at compromised quality, and asked 3 specific questions about the Cincinnati buyer's requirements before she'd commit to anything. Well, she said. It's good, he said. It sounds like you. That's the question. Is that a problem? No, he said. Pennington respects people who know their business. This reads like someone who knows theirs. She took the letter back and read it once more. Then she sealed it without changing anything. But Pennington wrote back in 3 weeks. He answered all 3 questions. He didn't make anything of the fact that he was corresponding with a woman working out of a wilderness homestead, which Silas thought was probably the best thing about him. He proposed a trial arrangement, 6 finished pieces over 60 days, his choice of items from a list he enclosed, to assess consistency before committing to anything larger. Evelyn accepted. The 60 days were not easy. Silas heard about the difficulty not from her directly, but from the texture of her letters during that period. Shorter, more clipped, with the occasional sentence that let something through. The stitching on the second bag took apart 3 times before I had it right. Or, I lost 2 days to weather and now I'm behind my own schedule, which I hate. He wrote back with nothing in particular. Not reassurance, which he knew she didn't want, but just responses that showed he was reading carefully. He told her about the situation with a feed supplier who'd shorted him on a grain order. He told her about a conversation he'd had with a homesteader from the south end of the territory who was asking about bulk purchasing arrangements. Ordinary things. The texture of the days. She delivered all 6 pieces on day 58. He was there when she unpacked them, setting each piece on the counter in turn. A saddlebag, 2 belts, a document case with fitted interior dividers that he hadn't known she was planning, a pair of riding gloves with extended cuffs, and a sheath for a Bowie-style knife with a secondary loop for a small tool. He looked at all 6 for a long time. "The document case," he said finally. "I added the dividers because the specifications didn't forbid it," she said, "and they improve the product." "They do." He picked it up. The interior was lined with a softer leather. The dividers fitted with small brass tabs for indexing. It was the kind of detail that made a buyer feel understood. "Pennington's going to want to know if that's standard or an ad." "It's standard," she said. "I don't make things halfway." He packed them carefully and got them on the next supply wagon to Millfield. Pennington's response came back in 2 weeks. Trial successful. Ready to discuss terms for ongoing arrangement. Please advise on capacity. Silas read it standing in the back room and then went out to find Evelyn still at the counter. She'd been going through the reference catalog he kept for hardware supplies, making notes on the paper she always carried. "Pennington wants to talk terms," he said. She looked up. Something moved across her face. Not triumph exactly, more like the particular relief of having been right about something you weren't entirely sure you were right about. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then she was already moving on. "I need to think about capacity before I talk to him," she said. "I can't promise more than I can deliver. Take the time you need. I also need to think about price. If he's moving these to Cincinnati buyers, his margin is significant. I want to know what I'm actually worth to him before I agree to terms." Silas nodded. "Do you want me to find out what the Cincinnati market is paying for comparable work?" She looked at him. "Yes. And don't soften the numbers for me. Whatever the real figure is." "I never soften numbers," he said. "You know that." "I do," she said. "That's why I'm asking." Cole made his 3rd approach in June. Silas wasn't present for it this time. He heard it from 2 different people the following day, which meant it had been visible enough to become something the town was aware of. Cole had found Evelyn at the general store again, which Silas suspected wasn't coincidence, and had made a point of helping her load supplies onto her horse without being asked to. That part was manageable. What wasn't manageable was what he'd said afterward, which had been heard by at least 3 people within range. He had suggested, with the full weight of a man who believed he was being reasonable, that a woman living alone in the backcountry was a concern to the community, and that if she was going to continue the arrangement, meaning her business arrangement with Silas, which he'd named specifically, it might be wise to have some sort of formal arrangement in place so that everyone knew what the situation was. What he meant by formal arrangement he hadn't said directly, but the implication was clear to everyone within earshot. When Silas heard this the next morning, he sat with it for a few minutes. He wasn't a man who made quick decisions about things that mattered. He thought about what Cole had said and what it meant, and he thought about the position it put Evelyn in, the way it turned her business, which was her own achievement, into a question about her personal circumstances. He thought about whether to say something to Cole directly. He decided against it. Not because he was avoiding it, but because he understood that Cole's opinion of the situation was irrelevant to the situation. Evelyn didn't need him to fight that battle. She was more than capable of fighting it or ignoring it, and either choice was hers. What he could do was make sure the business itself was solid enough that gossip had nowhere useful to attach. He wrote to Pennington that week about the Cincinnati market figures. He wrote to 2 other contacts he hadn't used yet about the expanding leather goods market. He spent an evening organizing the ledger records for Evelyn's account into a clean, clear document that she could use in any negotiation to show exactly what her work had produced over the past year. When she came in the following week, he put the ledger document in front of her before she'd even taken off her coat. She looked at it, then at him. "Cole?" she said. "He said some things," Silas said. "I'm not going to tell you how to handle that, but I figured you should have this." She picked up the document, looked at the figures, the running total of sales, the prices achieved, the trajectory over 14 months of work. It was, laid out plainly, The record of a business that had grown from 7 pelts on a counter to a working arrangement with a Millfield broker and an inquiry from a Cincinnati buyer. She set it down. What did he say exactly? Silas told her without editorial. Her face was very still while he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He named our arrangement specifically, she said. Yes. As if it required explanation. Yes. She looked out the window for a moment. There was a group of women from the church committee crossing the street in the direction of Francis Alcott's hotel, and 2 of them glanced toward the trading post in the way that people glance at things they've been talking about recently. I'm not going to explain myself to Harlan Cole, she said. I know, or to anyone else who's decided my life is their business. I know that too. She turned back and looked at him. Her gray eyes were very direct. Does it cause problems for you, what he's suggesting? No, Silas said. He meant it cleanly, without performance. My reputation is built on 14 years of straight dealing. Cole's opinion of my personal associations doesn't touch that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, All right. And that was that. She picked up the ledger document and folded it into her pack and moved on to the business of the day. But something had settled between them in that exchange. Something that had been uncertain clarified without being stated. He'd chosen a side without making a production of it, and she'd noticed. Well, the summer brought more work and more complexity in the way that good things generally do. Pennington confirmed terms in July, a standing arrangement for finished leather goods, with pricing that Evelyn had negotiated herself over 3 letters, ending up at a rate that made Silas raise an eyebrow when she showed him the final figure. You squeezed him, he said. I gave him a fair price for excellent work, she said. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. He agreed without much argument. He argued plenty. But I had the Cincinnati figures you sent me, and I knew what comparable work was going for, and I didn't move from my number until he gave me a reason to. She paused. He respected it, actually. At the end of the second letter, he said I drove a harder bargain than most men he dealt with. How did you respond to that? I thanked him and told him I'd drive the same bargain next time. Silas laughed. Genuinely, not the polite version. She looked slightly startled by it, then something in her own expression loosened. You've built something real here, he said. You understand that. I built a start, she said. There's a difference. But she said it with a little less deflection than she usually used when he said something like that, which he noticed. The workload that summer was real and visible. She was managing the trapping line, the fur preparation, and the finished goods production simultaneously, and the letters from July and August had the compressed quality of someone who was genuinely overextended and managing it through organization rather than rest. She'd hired a local boy to help with the most basic labor on her property, hauling water, chopping wood, the physical work that didn't require her specific skill. Smart, Silas said when she mentioned it. Expensive, she said. Both things are true. She had also started experimenting with vegetable tanning in earnest, using the manual he'd lent her and 3 additional books she'd sourced through him on consignment from a bookseller in Harker's Crossing. The results in the early stages were inconsistent, which clearly frustrated her. She mentioned it once in a letter with the flat brevity of someone who doesn't like admitting difficulty and is doing it anyway. The tanning is not cooperating. I've had 3 batches come out too hard. I know what I'm doing wrong, but fixing it is slower than I'd like. He wrote back, slow is usually better than wrong. Her response came 5 days later. I know that. It doesn't make slow more comfortable. He read that line and felt for the first time something he was not quite ready to name. It was in the particular quality of the exchange, the way she'd said something true about herself that she hadn't needed to say, the trust that implied. He put the letter with the others. Francis Alcott caught him on a Thursday in August outside the trading post, with the timing of a woman who had been waiting for a moment when there was no easy exit. I want to say something to you directly, Francis said. All right. People are talking about Mrs. Hartwell, about the 2 of you. I know, Silas said. I want you to understand I'm not one of them. I think she's... Francis paused, assembling something carefully. I think she's more capable than most people here give her credit for, and I think you've been fair to her in a way that not everyone would be. Silas waited because there was clearly a second part. But there are women in this town, Francis continued, who are going to make her life harder because they don't know what to do with a woman who doesn't fit the shape they expect. And some of the men are going to make it harder for different reasons. I thought you should know it's more visible than you might think. What is? That you respect her. Francis looked slightly uncomfortable saying it plainly. It's unusual. People notice unusual things. He thought about that. She respects herself, he said. I'm just not getting in the way of it. Francis looked at him for a moment. That is genuinely a more unusual thing than you seem to realize, she said. She left, and he stood for a moment in the August heat thinking about what she'd said and what it implied about the world Evelyn was navigating every time she came into town. He knew it, of course. He wasn't naive about the texture of frontier society, about what women were expected to be and what happened to those who refused the shape. But hearing it from Francis, who was not a woman given to unnecessary sentiment, put a specific weight on it. He went back inside and wrote a letter to a leather buyer in a city 3 days' ride east, asking about market conditions for high-quality handmade goods, and at the end added a question about whether the buyer had interest in establishing a direct account with a producer, which would cut out 2 layers of the supply chain and benefit Evelyn more substantially than any arrangement she had currently. It was something he could do. So he did it. What? She came in on the last Friday of August with a piece of leatherwork he hadn't seen before. It was a rifle scabbard, the kind that attached to a saddle, for carrying a long gun on the trail. The leather was darker than her usual work, thicker, with a particular texture to the surface he didn't recognize. Vegetable tanned, he realized. The batch that had been giving her trouble. She set it on the counter without preamble. He examined it carefully. The leather had the characteristic firmness of proper vegetable tanning, a solidity that brain-tanned hides didn't have. The tooling on the exterior was restrained, a simple running border, nothing elaborate, which was the right choice for the harder material. The interior had a felt lining she'd fitted with a precision that the surface gave no hint of. You figured it out, he said. I figured out one part of it, she said, the temperature control in the soaking process. I'd been running it too warm. She looked at the scabbard. It's not perfect. The color isn't even all the way through. You can see it there at the seam. He looked. There was a slight variation in the leather's color at the side seam, subtle enough that a buyer wouldn't notice it. I see it, he said. A buyer won't. I will, she said. Next batch will be consistent. He straightened up and looked at her. She was looking at the scabbard with the particular expression she used for her own work. Not pride exactly, more like a demanding inventory, looking for where it fell short of what she'd intended. He wondered if she ever looked at something she'd made and just thought it was good. He suspected not often. You should be satisfied with this, he said. Most makers would be. Most makers aren't trying to sell to Cincinnati, she said. He didn't argue the point. She was right, and she knew what her work required better than he did. I'll send it to Pennington separately from the standing order, he said, as a sample of the new process. Let him know it's coming. She nodded. Then, unexpectedly, she sat down, not in her usual efficiency of motion, but with the careful movement of someone who is actually tired and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. I'm behind on the fall trapping preparation, she said. Trying to do both is harder than I calculated. Can the boy you hired help more? He's good for labor. He's not a trapper, and he can't learn it in a season. She rubbed the side of her neck with one hand, a gesture he recognized as involuntary. I need to decide what I'm doing more of next year. I can't keep doing everything at the same level. Which would you choose? He asked. If you had to? She thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about everything. The leather work, she said. The trapping was Thomas's first. I learned it from him and I'm good at it. But the making, she paused. The making is mine. I built that from what he taught me, but it went somewhere he didn't take it. It was the most she'd said in a single moment about the distinction between what she'd inherited and what she'd created. He understood what it meant. The particular ownership of something you'd developed yourself past the point of what you were given. Then that's your answer, he said. It doesn't simplify the next 6 months. No, he agreed. But it simplifies everything after that. She looked at him. Something in her face was open in a way it wasn't always. The tiredness, maybe, or just the fact that she'd said something true out loud and it had been received without being redirected. You're irritatingly consistent, she said. You know that? I've been told, he said. Who told you? You, he said. A few months ago. You used a different word. She almost smiled. He caught it at the edge and then it was gone, and she stood and reached for her coat. I'll be back in 3 weeks, she said. I want to hear what Pennington says about the scabbard. I'll have his response by then, he said. She picked up her pack. At the door, she paused and looked back at him with an expression he'd never quite seen on her face before. Not the evaluating look, not the demanding inventory she turned on her own work. Something quieter than those, something that didn't require him to do anything with it. Thank you, Mercer, she said. For all of it. He nodded because the moment asked for something simple, and he was getting better at recognizing that. She went out into the August afternoon, and he stood in the trading post that smelled of leather and wood smoke, and the particular dry goods smell of a working frontier store. And he thought about what Francis had said about unusual things being noticed, and he thought about consistency, and he thought about a woman who had built something genuinely hers out of grief and stubbornness and remarkable talent. And he thought about the fact that he didn't want to watch that from a distance indefinitely. He hadn't said any of that. He wasn't ready yet. But the thought was there, clear and settled, the way certain things are clear when you've been honest enough with yourself long enough to stop pretending otherwise. Outside, the summer was burning itself toward autumn, and the work was not finished, and neither of them were where they were going yet. Pennington's letter about the rifle scabbard arrived in the second week of September, and it was not the response Silas had expected. It was not one letter, it was two, one addressed to him in Pennington's usual clipped business prose, and one addressed directly to Evelyn Hartwell, care of Mercer Trading Post, Redemption Hollow. The second envelope was sealed, and Silas set it aside without opening it, which cost him something, because Pennington's letter to him contained just enough information to make him want badly to know what was in the other one. Pennington's letter said, "The scabbard has generated significant interest from a buyer I was not expecting. A supply firm operating out of St. Louis that contracts for military and commercial outfitting. They're asking about production capacity for a line of vegetable tanned goods. I have taken the liberty of providing Mrs. Hartwell's name as the maker. A representative named Gerald Fitch will be in contact. I recommend she take the meeting seriously." Silas read it twice. Then he set it flat on the counter and looked at it the way he looked at large numbers, not with excitement, which was a feeling that made men sloppy, but with the careful attention of someone who wanted to understand what was real before deciding how to feel about it. A St. Louis supply firm, military and commercial outfitting. Those were not small words. Those were words that meant a different order of magnitude than anything they had been discussing. He sent a rider to Miller's Creek the same afternoon with Pennington's sealed letter and a brief note of his own. "There's also a letter for you from Pennington directly. Come when you can." She arrived 4 days later, which told him she'd read the letters and thought about them carefully before she moved. She came in the morning, before the town was fully awake, and she didn't have a pack with her. She'd come only for this. She sat down across from him at the small table in the back room where he did his accounts, which was where they'd taken to having the longer conversations. She put both letters on the table, Pennington's to her and his note, and pushed them toward him. "You can read hers," she said. "I want you to." He read it. Pennington had been more direct with her than with him. He'd laid out the St. Louis firm's interest plainly, named the potential contract value in approximate terms that made Silas go very still when he read them, and told her that Gerald Fitch would be passing through the territory in October and wanted to meet with her at a location of her choosing. He set the letter down. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "Not what you think I should do, what you actually think." "I think this is real," he said. "I think Pennington doesn't pass along contacts that aren't serious. And I think a St. Louis supply firm contracting for military outfitting is a buyer with volume and consistency behind it that would change your operation fundamentally." "Change it how?" "Scale. You'd need to produce at a level you can't reach alone. You'd need to hire skilled help, invest in equipment, probably expand your workspace significantly." He paused. "You'd also have more security than you have now. A long-term contract with a firm like that is the difference between weather and building." She was quiet. She had her hands flat on the table, and he noticed that the scar on her left hand was more visible in the morning light, that pale line running from her knuckle to her wrist. "What do I lose?" she said. He respected the question. It was the right one. Control, probably. A buyer that size sets specifications. They want consistency, which means you make what they order in the quantities they order on the schedule they set. Some of the creative latitude you have now goes away. My quality standards stay mine? That would need to be in the contract, explicitly. She nodded slowly. And if I say no to Fitch? If I keep the scale I have with Pennington? You keep what you've built. It's a solid operation. It'll grow at the pace you can manage. He chose the next words carefully. But this kind of opportunity doesn't come twice. Fitch found you because the scabbard moved through a chain of hands, and every person who touched it said the same thing. That doesn't happen again just because you want it to. She looked at the wall behind him for a moment. The shelf of reference books, the account ledgers in their row, the map of the territory he'd pinned up 3 years ago and never taken down. I need to see the homestead before I decide, she said. He wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. You need to see your own homestead? I need to see it with this in front of me, she said. I need to stand there and know whether what I'm considering fits the place and the life I've built, or whether it changes them into something I don't recognize. She met his eyes. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. And it did. I'd like you to come with me, she said, if you're willing. He was careful. He understood the weight of what she was asking, not just the miles, but the particular intimacy of being invited to the place she'd built alone, the place that was entirely hers. He didn't want to receive that carelessly. When? He said. 2 weeks, after I've met with Fitch's initial inquiry. I'll correspond with him first, get a sense of what he's actually proposing, and then I want to think about it on my own ground. I'll arrange coverage for the Post, he said. Gerald Fitch sent a preliminary letter before his visit, as promised, and Evelyn showed it to Silas when she came through Redemption Hollow on her way to meet the supply representative at the hotel. Fitch was passing through from the county seat and had arranged the meeting at the settlement, which Silas suspected was a deliberate choice, a neutral location that didn't require him to travel to her territory and didn't require her to travel to his city, which was a more thoughtful arrangement than he'd expected from a commercial buyer. The letter was professional and thorough. Fitch outlined what his firm was looking for: a sustained supply of vegetable tanned leather goods for military saddlery and field equipment, with a secondary line for civilian commercial supply. He named quantities and a general price range. He asked about her production infrastructure. He did not, Silas noticed, ask anything about her personal situation or express any surprise at the maker's gender. Pennington had apparently prepared him, or Fitch was simply not the sort of man who considered it relevant. He knows what he wants, Evelyn said. Does it match what you can give? Parts of it, not all of it. The quantities he's naming for the military line would require equipment I don't have. What equipment? She described it. A proper tanning vat setup, a mechanical splitter for consistent hide thickness, additional stretching frames, workspace that could accommodate the volume. It was specific and practical, the list of someone who had already costed it out in their head. Could you build that capacity? He asked. With capital I don't have yet, yes, she said, or with a contract that guaranteed the revenue to justify the investment, which is exactly what Fitch is offering. Which is exactly the problem, she said. He wants the capacity before the contract. I need the contract to build the capacity. That's the negotiation. Silas thought about it. Not necessarily. You could propose a staged arrangement, a smaller initial contract at current capacity, with a structured expansion plan tied to contract milestones. He gets quality now, volume later. You get the security to invest. She looked at him with the measuring look. Can you write that up, the structure of it? I want to go into the meeting with something specific. Give me an hour, he said. She went to the hotel to wait, and he sat at his account table and wrote out a proposed contract framework, 3 pages, with the stage structure clear and the quality control provisions explicit. He had done enough commercial negotiation over the years to know what language held up and what didn't. When he brought it to her at the hotel, she read it at the small table by the window, and he watched her go through it the way she went through everything, systematically, missing nothing. She made 2 small notations in the margin with the pencil she always carried. "This is good," she said. "I'm going to change one thing." "Which?" She showed him a clause about inspection rights that she'd reworded to make the standard bilateral rather than the buyer's prerogative only. It was a sharper version of what he'd written. "Better," he said. The meeting with Fitch lasted 2 hours, and Silas was not present for it. He waited at the trading post and tried to do useful work, and mostly moved things from one place to another without much purpose. She came in at 3 in the afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and he could not read her expression clearly enough to know what had happened. "Well," he said. He agreed to the stage structure," she said. "In principle. He wants a formal proposal in writing within 30 days. That's a yes." "That's a maybe with good intentions behind it," she said. "A yes is a signed contract." But something in her voice was different from usual. A quality of restrained forward motion, like water behind a dam that is still holding, but is being asked to hold more than it was built for. She came to the counter and sat down. "He's serious," she said. "He knows the work. He asked the right questions about the process. He didn't—" She stopped. "Didn't what?" "He didn't make anything of the circumstances," she said. "He just talked about the work." He understood what that had cost her to notice, how careful she'd been not to expect it, and what it meant that it had happened anyway. "Good," he said simply. "He wants to visit the operation eventually, before the full contract is signed." She looked at her hands. "Which means people coming to the homestead. To my place. Is that a problem?" "It's a change," she said. "Everything about this is a change." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm still going to think about it on my own ground before I write the proposal. I need to know what I'm committing before I commit." 2 weeks, he said. "I haven't forgotten. But the ride to the Hartwell homestead took most of a morning. The country past Miller's Creek changed in a way that Silas felt but couldn't entirely describe. The same territorial landscape, the same sky, but with a quality of remove that the land around Redemption Hollow didn't have. The trail narrowed and then opened and then narrowed again through stands of pine and stretches of open meadow where the grass was going gold with the season. The creek ran to their left for most of the ride, clear and cold-sounding. He'd ridden this kind of country before, but not this particular piece of it, and he understood within the first hour why she'd built her life here rather than somewhere more accessible. It had the quality of a place that expected something from you in order to give anything back. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't soft either. It paid attention to whether you were paying attention. She rode ahead of him for much of the way, not to distance herself, but simply because she knew the trail, and he didn't. And he watched her move through the landscape with the particular ease of someone who has covered the same ground hundreds of times and knows it the way you know a room in your own house in the dark. She pointed things out without ceremony. "That's where the beaver dams start. They've expanded this year." And later, "The otter slides down that bank. I've taken 3 off that stretch." And once, more quietly, for no particular practical reason, "Thomas and I camped here the first winter. We didn't know then what we were doing, and we were cold the whole time." He didn't say anything when she said that. He just noted where she'd pointed, a flat clearing near the creek bend, unremarkable except to her. The homestead appeared around a long curve in the trail, and his first impression was that it was more substantial than he'd imagined and more worn than he'd imagined simultaneously. The main structure was solid, log construction, well-fitted, with a covered workroom built onto the north side that was twice the size of the living quarters. A smaller building behind it had the layout of a storage and curing space. The fencing around the near property was functional and well-maintained. Everything had been built by 2 people and then maintained by 1. She dismounted without particular drama and tied her horse to the post by the workroom. He did the same and followed her inside, and that was where the place became fully real to him. The workroom was large and organized with the precision of someone for whom organization was not a personality trait but a professional necessity. Tools hung on a systematic arrangement of pegs and brackets along 2 walls. 3 stretching frames of different sizes stood in a row near the north window. On the main work table, a heavy construction that he suspected Thomas Hartwell had built and that Evelyn had reinforced, were 2 hides in progress and the tools she'd been using on them, set aside when she'd left for Redemption Hollow. Along the east wall were the tanning supplies, the vats she'd constructed from timber and sealed with pitch, the bark and chemical agents on shelves above them. The thermometer hung at eye level on a cord. Everything was worn from use and set at exactly the right height for a woman of her particular build. He stood in the middle of it and understood something that the letters and the sample pieces had only partially communicated. This was not a temporary arrangement or a hobbyist's enterprise. This was a working operation built from nothing by someone who had decided to treat her own skills with complete seriousness. "This is what you built," he said. It came out differently than he intended, not as an observation, but as something closer to acknowledgement. She was standing by the work table, running her hand along its edge. "Most of it," she said. "Thomas built the frames and the table. I've added everything since." He looked at the tanning vats. "The expansion Fitch needs. Could it happen here?" "Not as it currently stands. I'd need to build out the workroom space." She moved to the north wall and put her hand flat against it. "Take this wall out, extend 15 feet north. That gives me room for 2 more vats and the mechanical splitter. The stretching area stays where it is." She turned around and looked at the space with the same demanding inventory she used on finished work. "It would cost more than I have. The contract would cover it. The contract would need to exist first." He looked at her, at the way she stood in the space she'd built, the way her hands moved when she was thinking through a physical problem. She was entirely at home here in a way she was almost nowhere else. The slight guardedness she carried in town, the careful maintenance of a certain distance, none of that was present here. She was just herself. "You're afraid of losing this," he said. Not an accusation, just a recognition. She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "Not the building. The way of working. I set my own hours, my own standards, my own direction. A contract that size starts to set those things for me. The proposal we wrote protects some of it, not all of it." She sat on the edge of the work table, not graceful, just practical, the way she did most things. "I've been doing this alone for 4 years. I know what that costs and what it gives. I don't know what it costs to build something larger." He sat down on a stool near the wall. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines, a sound that was constant here in a way it wasn't in town. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway. When Thomas died," he said carefully, "you stayed because you'd earned this ground, because going back meant leaving something you'd paid for." "Yes." "This decision is the same kind," he said. "Not whether to take the contract, whether to believe that what you've built can survive getting larger. Whether you trust yourself to know when to stop if it starts to cost what you don't want to pay." She looked at him for a long time. The light through the north window was the particular flat gold of October afternoon, and it made the room feel like something preserved. "I don't know if I trust that yet," she said. "That's honest." "It's enough to start," he said. "You don't have to know the whole answer before you write the proposal. You just have to know your terms clearly enough to hold them. And if he won't take the terms, then you have Pennington and a working business, and you keep building at the pace you choose." She exhaled, not dramatically, just the sound of something releasing slightly. "You're not going to tell me what to do," she said, "even now." "It's not my decision," he said. "A lot of men would consider it their business. A lot of men are wrong about what's their business." He meant it without edge. It was just true. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stood up from the table and went to the small window that looked north toward the tree line, where the shadows were already starting to lengthen into evening. "Thomas would have taken the contract without thinking twice," she said. "He was braver than me about risk." "He was a different person," Silas said, "with a different operation and different stakes. I used to think I was less than he was, for being more careful. Are you still less?" She was quiet. "No," she said finally. "I don't think so. I think I'm different." A pause. "I think careful and brave aren't opposites." He didn't say anything. The wind in the pines was the only sound. After a while, she moved away from the window. "I'll make coffee," she said. "It's a long ride back and the temperature is dropping." He helped her with the fire without being asked and without making anything of it, and she moved around the small kitchen attached to the main room with the efficiency of someone who cooked alone and had arranged everything for exactly that. She found 2 cups without searching for them. She measured the coffee without looking at the measure. They drank it standing, looking out the south window at the property. The light was going now, the sky turning the deep blue that comes just before dark. "I'm going to write the proposal," she said, "with the terms we discussed, and I'm going to hold them." "I know," he said. "If he takes them, I'll need help navigating the early stages, the legal structure, the supply chain expansion." She looked at him sideways. "I'll need you." He held the coffee cup in both hands. "You have me," he said. It was a simple thing to say. It was the truest thing he'd said in some time. She looked at him then. Not the measuring look, not the demanding inventory, not any of the professional distances she maintained with such discipline. Just looked at him, in the way people look at each other when something has been said that changes the shape of the space between them. "Mercer," she said. "Yes." "Don't make that a promise you don't mean." "I don't make promises I don't mean," he said. "You know that about me by now." She held his gaze a moment longer, then she looked back out the window. "It'll be a hard winter," she said. "The signs are there." "They usually are," he said. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the east, over the tree line where the trail ran back toward Redemption Hollow. The homestead sat in its clearing with the particular solidity of a place built to last, built by people who understood that the land didn't care about your intentions, only about what you actually did, day after day, in all kinds of weather. He thought about the distance between here and town, 8 miles that she covered alone, both directions, in every season. He thought about the letters, and the ledger document, and the saddlebag on the counter, and the moment in the doorway 2 weeks ago when he hadn't been able to read her face. He thought about the word she'd used. Need. She had not used that word loosely. He knew that about her. The coffee was getting cold, and neither of them moved to go inside. And the night came in quietly around the homestead the way it does in country that has no other lights to compete with, completely and without apology. The proposal took her 11 days to write. Silas knew this because he counted, not obsessively, but in the way you count things when you're waiting on something that matters, and you've run out of useful ways to pretend you aren't waiting. He had sent her back to the homestead that October evening with a copy of the contract framework and a list of legal terms he'd annotated from memory. And since then there had been one letter, brief and businesslike, asking him to clarify a specific clause about inspection scheduling. He clarified it. She didn't write again until the proposal was done. When it arrived, carried by the same boy she'd hired for labor, who made the ride into town twice a month now as a matter of routine, it was 12 pages in her handwriting, which was not elegant but was extremely clear. The letters formed with the same precision she used for everything that required exactness. She'd included a covering note. "Read it before I get there. Tell me what's wrong with it." He read it that evening at his account table, twice through, with a pencil in his hand. There wasn't much wrong with it. The stage structure was clear. The quality control provisions were specific and enforceable. She had included a clause he hadn't suggested, a right of first refusal on any expansion of the contract scope, which meant that if Fitch's firm wanted more than the initial agreement covered, they had to come back to her before going elsewhere. It was a sophisticated piece of negotiating, and he sat with it for a while, understanding that she had thought of it entirely on her own. He wrote 3 marginal notes on minor language issues and 1 substantive comment on the payment schedule, which he thought was too backloaded. Then he set it on the counter and waited. She arrived 2 days later. She read his notes standing at the counter, still in her coat, her horse not yet fully cooled outside. When she got to the payment schedule comment, she stopped. "You think he'll push back on front-loading?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I think he'll try," Silas said. "But your leverage is the quality of the work and the fact that he came to you. You don't need to take the worst payment terms just because he proposes them." He could walk. He could. He won't. He leaned on the counter. "Evelyn, he sent a representative out here from St. Louis. That's not a speculative trip. He wants this." She looked at the payment clause again. She picked up his pencil and rewrote the schedule in the margin. Not exactly what he'd suggested, but a compromise she'd arrived at in the 30 seconds she'd been thinking about it, which was better than his version. "Like that?" she said. He looked. "Like that," he said. She set the pencil down and finally took off her coat. "I'll send it to Fitch this week," she said. "And then I wait." "And then you wait," he agreed. She looked around the trading post with the particular expression of someone who has run out of the next thing to do and doesn't know what to do with themselves without one. He recognized it because he saw it in the mirror sometimes. "Cole came by again," he said. "2 days ago." She went still. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if I knew when you were next coming to town." He kept his voice even. "I told him I didn't keep your schedule." "Did he say anything else?" "He said he'd heard you were doing significant business with outside buyers, and that the community had a right to know what kind of operations were being run through the settlement." She was quiet for a moment. Her face had the flat stillness of someone containing something that would be large if it got out. "He used the word community," she said. "He did. As if the community has a stake in my business. That's the implication." She picked up her coat from the counter where she'd set it and held it in both hands. "What did you say?" "I told him that Mrs. Hartwell's business was conducted through legitimate commercial channels, that all transactions were properly recorded, and that if he had a specific legal concern, he was welcome to take it to the sheriff in the county seat." He paused. "He didn't have a specific legal concern." She looked at him. "You said that directly." "I said it politely," he said, "which is worse, usually." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something between the two that was more honest than either. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Not until there's nothing left to question." "No," Silas agreed. "What does that mean for you, if he decides to make it a public issue?" He'd thought about this. He'd been thinking about it since the conversation with Francis back in August, and he'd come to a conclusion he'd been sitting with long enough that it was settled. "It means I deal with it," he said. "Same as any other business obstacle." He met her eyes. "Cole's opinion of my associations doesn't change my associations, Evelyn. I thought we established that." "We did," she said. "I'm asking again because the situation has gotten larger. My answer is the same size it was then." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she hung her coat back on the peg by the door, a gesture so ordinary and so entirely hers that he felt the weight of it without being able to explain why. "All right," she said. The waiting was its own kind of difficulty. Fitch's firm received the proposal in November and did not respond immediately, which Pennington had warned was their standard practice. They reviewed everything through their legal office before any principal replied. Silas relayed this to Evelyn, and she received it without visible frustration, which told him she'd already accounted for the delay and was managing herself accordingly. What was harder is the weeks between the proposal and the response was everything that wasn't the proposal. The winter was coming in the way she'd predicted, hard and early, with 2 significant snows before December that closed the northern road on 3 separate occasions. The letters between the homestead and the trading post took longer to arrive, traveled by whoever happened to be making the route for other reasons, and Silas found himself reading them with a particular attention that had less to do with business than he wanted to admit. She wrote about the tanning process, which she had continued refining even in the cold. She wrote about a problem with one of the stretching frames that she'd fixed herself by replacing the crossbar with a heavier timber. She wrote about the trapping line, which she was maintaining at reduced scale, just enough to keep the skills from going stale, she said, which was a phrase that told him something about how she thought about herself. He wrote back about the supply chain situation, a delayed shipment from the Eastern distributor that had left him short on 3 product categories, about a dispute between 2 homesteaders on the South Road that had involved him as an unwilling arbitrator because he'd extended credit to both of them, about a book he'd ordered that had arrived damaged and the particular irritation of that. And once, at the end of a letter about nothing in particular, he wrote, "The trading post is quieter in winter. I find I notice it more than I used to." He didn't explain what he meant by that. He sent the letter before he could revise it. Her response, which arrived 8 days later and was mostly about the tanning process, ended with a single line. "Winter is quiet here too. It wasn't always something I minded." He read that sentence several times. He understood what it meant. The shift from wasn't to the implied present, the particular weight of the past tense. She was telling him something without quite telling him. She was doing what she always did with things that mattered, approaching carefully, saying the minimum that was true, and watching to see what he did with it. He wrote back, "Some quiet is different from other quiet." This time her response came in 5 days, faster than the winter road should have allowed. She'd found a rider going in the direction of town. The letter was 3 paragraphs about the frame repair and one final line. Yes, that's exactly right. Well, Fitch's response arrived in the second week of December, 6 weeks after Evelyn had sent the proposal. It arrived at the trading post addressed to her, care of Mercer's, and Silas set it aside again without opening it and sent a rider immediately. She arrived 3 days later, the day before Christmas Eve, in weather that was cold enough that her breath was visible when she came through the door. She opened the letter at the counter. He watched her face. She read it once through without expression. Then she turned back to the first page and read the payment schedule section again. Then she set it down and looked at him. He accepted, she said. The terms? Mostly. He adjusted the first payment milestone, once it tied to delivery of the first batch rather than signing. She put her finger on the clause. That's reasonable. I'd have proposed the same if I were him. Everything else? The quality provisions are intact. The right of first refusal is in. The inspection protocol is bilateral. She looked at the last page. He wants to begin in March. First delivery by June. He did the arithmetic quickly. June was 8 months. Building out the workroom, sourcing the equipment, beginning production at the new scale. It was tight but achievable if she started immediately. Can you make June? He said. If I start the construction in January, she said. Before the ground softens. Framework in the cold, fit out in spring. What do you need? She looked at him. I need the contract signed before I invest in the build-out. I'm not expanding the workroom on a handshake. That's correct. Get the signatures first. And I need someone who knows the legal structure to review the final version before I sign. I can do that, or I can find a lawyer in the county seat. I want you to do it, she said. You know the history of the arrangement. A lawyer in the county seat knows nothing. He nodded. Send it to me when Fitch has his signatures on it, before you add yours. She folded the letter carefully and put it inside her coat. She was very still for a moment, not frozen, just contained in the way she was when something large had settled, and she was letting it settle fully before she moved. This is it, she said, more to herself than to him. Yes, he said. Everything changes after this. Some things, he said. Not everything. She looked at him. He hadn't meant it to land the way it did, as something beyond the business context, but it had, and he could see her receiving it in both registers simultaneously. Mercer, she said. Yes. She looked at the counter for a moment, then at him. I don't know how to do what comes after this. I know how to do the work. I don't know. She stopped. Started again. I've been alone for 4 years. I know that shape. This shape, I don't know. He was careful. Which shape are you talking about? Both of them, she said. The business shape. And the other one. He held that for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the north-facing window in its frame. December in the territory had a particular quality of insistence. You're not alone anymore, he said, in either shape. That's been true for a while. She looked at him steadily. Her gray eyes were direct and undefended in a way they weren't always. The particular openness that came when she'd decided to stop managing herself and just be present. I know, she said. I've known for a while. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The wind pushed at the window again. I'm not good at this, she said. I should say that plainly. Neither am I, he said. I was married once, and I wasn't good at it then either. What happened? She needed something different than what I had. I didn't understand that until she was already gone. He said it without bitterness. It was just old geography now. I was better at the trading post than I was at paying attention to what mattered. And now? I'm better at paying attention, he said. I've had time to practice. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite the measuring look. It was softer than that, and more direct. The look of someone who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally decided it completely. I love Thomas, she said. That's not going to go away. I know, he said. I'm not asking it to. It's not a competition. No. And I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I want to be clear about that. You've been clear about that since the first day you came in here, he said. I never thought otherwise. She exhaled. Then she said very quietly, What are you looking for? He thought about it honestly. Not the polished version, but the actual thing. Someone whose company makes the world larger, he said, not smaller. Someone who challenges me and doesn't apologize for it. Someone I can respect completely. He looked at her. I'm not looking for someone to fill a space. I'm looking for someone who makes a different kind of space. She held his gaze. The wind outside had settled briefly, and the trading post was very quiet. That's a careful answer, she said. I'm a careful man. I know. A pause. It's one of the things I... She stopped, looked away at the window, then back. It's one of the things. He didn't push. He understood her well enough by now to know that she said the most when she was given room to stop. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I'm here. The work is here. You know where to find me. She nodded once. Then she straightened up from the counter with the decisive efficiency she used when she'd finished thinking about something and was ready to move. I have to get back before dark, she said. I know. She got her coat. At the door she paused, which she'd been doing lately. Pausing at the door on the way out, a small hesitation that was new. He'd started to think of it as her version of something she hadn't found the words for yet. Merry Christmas, Mercer, she said. Merry Christmas, Evelyn, he said. She went out into the December afternoon, and he stood at the window and watched her ride north until the trail curved and she was gone. January came in brutally. The temperature dropped in the first week and stayed there, the kind of cold that had a physical weight to it, that made the air feel thick. The northern road was impassable for 12 days in the middle of the month, and the settlement pulled inward the way frontier towns did in hard weather. People staying close to their own heat, commerce slowing, the general human machinery of the place running at reduced speed. Silas heard nothing from the homestead for 18 days, which was the longest gap since they'd begun corresponding. He told himself it was the road. He believed it, mostly. But on the 17th day he was short with a customer for no particular reason. And on the 18th he caught himself checking the north road from the window 3 times in an afternoon. The letter arrived on the 19th day, carried by a trapper who'd come down from the upper territory and passed through her part of the country. It was 2 pages. The construction on the workroom expansion had begun. She'd found 2 men willing to work through the cold for a fair wage, and the frame was up, and the new north wall was taking shape. She'd ordered the mechanical splitter from a supplier in Harker's Crossing, and it would arrive in spring. The first 2 batches of the new tanning setup were already in process. Then, at the bottom of the second page, in the same plain handwriting she used for everything, I've been thinking about what you said, about the kind of space. I think I understand what you mean. I think I want to find out if that's what this is. He read that 3 times. Then he folded the letter and put it with the others and went and stood at the front window of the trading post and looked out at the frozen street for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the feeling settle. He wrote back that evening. He said he was glad the construction was moving forward. He said the county road would likely clear by the end of the month. He said 3 other ordinary things. And at the end he wrote, I think you already know what it is. So do I. We've known for a while. He sent it and went back to work. The signed contract from Fitch arrived in February, delivered through Pennington with a brief note confirming all terms as agreed. Silas reviewed it the evening it arrived, going through every clause against the draft he'd helped her write. It was clean. Fitch's lawyers had made 2 minor modifications in language that changed nothing substantial. The quality provisions were intact. The right of first refusal was in, word for word. The payment schedule was what she'd negotiated. He wrote her a 1-line letter. Contract is clean, sign it. Her response came back in 4 days. Already did. He smiled at that, the brevity of it, the confidence. She'd been ready. Cole made one more appearance in February, on a morning when Silas happened to be loading a supply wagon out front, and Cole stopped and offered, with his easy smile and his careful casualness, that he understood Silas had been spending time out at the Hartwell place. I was there once, Silas said without stopping what he was doing, in October. People talk, Cole said. People do, Silas agreed pleasantly. Cole waited for something more, and when it didn't come, he shifted his weight. She's a fine-looking woman, he said. I just think it's worth considering whether the association is... Cole. Silas set down the box he was holding and looked at the deputy directly. He kept his voice even, not angry, just clear. Mrs. Hartwell is a businesswoman I work with. The nature of our association is our concern and not yours. I'd appreciate it if you'd let it stay that way." Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he touched his hat and moved on. That was the last time Cole raised the subject. But Evelyn came to town in the last week of February, the first time since December. The road had cleared and the worst of the winter was breaking, the air carrying that first faint suggestion of something warmer underneath the cold. She came into the trading post and set a finished piece on the counter, the first item produced under the Fitch contract specifications. It was a military-style saddlebag, heavier and more utilitarian than her civilian work, but made with the same exactness. She set it down and looked at him. "First piece," she said. He examined it. It was excellent. "Fitch is going to be satisfied," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't say it with arrogance. She said it the way she said things that were simply true. She looked around the trading post, the shelves, the ledger on the counter, the map on the wall. She'd been looking at these things for almost 2 years now. They'd become familiar to her in the way places become familiar when you've spent real time in them, and some of that time has mattered. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." She looked at him directly, which she always did when the things she was saying mattered. "You said you're not going anywhere, that you're here." "Yes." "I need to know if you mean that past the business," she said. "I'm not asking for everything at once. I'm asking if you mean it past the business." He came around from behind the counter, not dramatically, just moving to where she was standing, the width of the counter no longer between them. He was close enough now that he could see the particular gray of her eyes clearly, the small lines at their corners from years of outdoor light. "I mean it completely," he said. "Past the business, and past this season, and past whatever Fitch decides, and past Cole, and past any of it." She held his gaze. Her face was not perfectly composed. There was something working in it, something that didn't have a name yet, but was real. "I haven't let myself want something like this since Thomas," she said. "I'm not sure I trust my own judgment about it." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust blindly. I'm asking you to trust what you've actually seen." She thought about that. He watched her think about it, the honest, unsentimental working through that was entirely characteristic of her. "What I've seen," she said slowly, "is a man who told me the truth when he could have told me something easier, who didn't try to manage me, who showed up when it mattered and stayed out of the way when that mattered." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, Mercer, I'm telling you, I'm not just finding out anymore." It was Evelyn Hartwell's version of saying something enormous. He understood that. He received it exactly as it was meant. "I hear you," he said. Outside, February was doing its uncertain thing, cold still, but with the quality of something that was beginning to give. The hardest part of the winter was past. The road was open. And the first piece of a new contract sat on the counter of a trading post at the north end of a frontier settlement, waiting to begin its journey east. Neither of them moved for another moment, standing in the space between the counter and the door, in the ordinary afternoon light of a Wednesday in late winter. It was not a grand moment in any external sense, but it was the kind of moment that you know, even when you're in it, that you will carry for a very long time. Spring came the way it always did in that country. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week, then a hard frost, then 3 days of rain that turned the main street of Redemption Hollow into something closer to a creek bed than a road. Then finally, in the last week of March, the kind of morning that meant it. The air had a different quality. The mud started drying at the edges. The creek past Miller's Creek ran high and loud with snowmelt, and the beaver dams that Evelyn had pointed out on the October ride were busy with activity she described in a letter as almost aggressive in its optimism. The workroom expansion was finished by the 1st of April. She wrote to tell him in a letter that was characteristically brief about the achievement and characteristically detailed about the problems. The north wall had settled 2 inches more than the builder had anticipated, requiring shimming along the base plate, and one of the new tanning vats had developed a slow seep at a corner joint that she'd had to reseal twice before it held. The mechanical splitter had arrived from Harker's Crossing with a bent drive shaft that had to be repaired before it was usable, which had cost her 10 days. "It's working now," she wrote at the end. "Everything is working now. Come see it when you can." He rode out on a Saturday in mid-April, and what he found was not the same place he'd seen in October. The workroom addition had doubled the north side of the building, its new timber walls still pale and fresh against the weathered gray of the original structure. Inside, the expanded space held the new tanning vats in a proper row. The mechanical splitter bolted to a heavy bench along the east wall. Additional stretching frames arranged in sequence by size. She had organized it with the same systematic precision as the original room, everything at the right height, everything with its place. She walked him through it with the manner of someone conducting a practical tour, not asking for admiration but explaining function. This vat held the initial soak. That shelf held the bark and chemical agents in order of use. The splitter ran off a hand crank and produced consistent thickness to within a 1/16 of an inch, which mattered for the Fitch contract specifications. "The first delivery goes out in 6 weeks," she said. 8 pieces. I'll have them done in 4. "You're ahead of schedule," he said. "I built the schedule to have room," she said. "I don't trust schedules that don't have room." He looked around the expanded workspace, the new and the old joined together, the place where she'd built something out of grief and stubbornness, now extended by her own hand into something larger than Thomas had ever imagined for it, and larger than she herself had imagined when she'd first walked into his trading post with 7 pelts wrapped in oilcloth. "You should be proud of this," he said. She looked at the room. "I am," she said, which was something she didn't say easily, and the fact that she said it simply, without deflecting, told him she'd made some kind of peace with allowing herself that. They had coffee again in the kitchen, and this time it was different from October, less formal, less weighted with pending decisions. The contract was signed. The workroom was built. The first delivery was on schedule. The things that had needed deciding were decided, and what remained was just the living of it, which turned out to be its own kind of difficult and its own kind of good. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him over her cup. "You've been working up to something since you got here." "Have I?" "You rode out here on a Saturday without any specific business reason," she said. "That's not nothing for you." He put his cup down. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not as a speech, not with any particular ceremony, just the fact of it," said plainly, because she was a person who received plain things better than elaborate ones. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her face and didn't try to read it. "Say the rest," she said. "Whatever else you came here to say." He thought about it. "I'm not asking because it would make the business tidier, or because of what Cole said, or because it's the expected thing. I'm asking because I've watched you build something extraordinary for 2 years, and I've watched you carry it mostly alone, and I don't want to watch from a distance anymore. I want to be in the same life, not managing it, just in it." She set her cup down on the table and looked at her hands for a moment. The scar on the left one, the calluses at her palm from the tools she used every day. "I was married before," she said. "You know what that was." "I know it was good," he said. "I know Thomas was a good man and you built something real with him. I'm not asking you to replace that." "You couldn't," she said. "And I don't mean that cruelly. I mean it's a different thing. What's here is a different thing. Is the different thing enough?" She looked up at him. "It's not a lesser thing," she said. "That's what I'm trying to say. It's not less than what I had. It's different, and yes." She paused. "Yes, Mercer, it's enough. It's more than enough." He let out a breath he hadn't quite realized he'd been holding. "I want things understood before we agree to anything," she said, and he recognized that this was her version of yes. Not the word yet, but the beginning of the conditions, which with Evelyn Hartwell was how trust was actually expressed. "Tell me," he said. "The business stays mine," she said. "The operation, the decisions, the contracts. I'm not a wife who hands the reins to her husband. I know that. The homestead stays in my name. That's fair. And if we disagree about something—" She stopped. "Thomas and I disagreed. We disagreed about real things, sometimes hard things. I need to know you can do that without it becoming a question of who's in charge." He thought about that honestly. "I'll disagree with you when I think you're wrong," he said. "I have before. You've disagreed with me. We've both survived it." "We have," she said. "That's the answer," he said. "I don't want a wife who agrees with me. I want you." She looked at him for a long time. The April morning was coming through the kitchen window. the particular light of early spring that is full of possibility and slightly cold still, like most things that are still becoming. "All right," she said. "Yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, not tightly, not dramatically, just held it. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen of the homestead she had built and was still building, while outside the spring continued its argument with the last of the winter. They were married in June, 3 weeks after the first Fitch delivery went out, and was received with a response from Gerald Fitch himself. A single sentence: "Product exceeds specification. Proceeding to next phase." The ceremony was small, not because they were hiding anything, but because neither of them was a person who needed a large audience for something true. Frances Alcott was there, having appointed herself to the task of making the occasion recognizable as an occasion, which she did by arriving with a cake she'd made herself and a practical gift of kitchen supplies that Evelyn actually needed. Gabe Hollister came with his wife. The boy who made the rides between the homestead and town came and stood in the back and looked uncomfortable in the way of young men at formal occasions. A few others. Cole was not there, which was nobody's doing. He'd transferred to a posting in another county in March, without fanfare. The sheriff had needed someone, Cole had gone, and Redemption Hollow had adjusted the way small towns adjust to departures, a brief period of noting the absence and then simply filling in around it. There was no long speech. The justice of the peace was efficient, and the words were the words. Evelyn wore a dress Frances had helped her find, dark blue, practical and cut, which was exactly right. She did not look like a woman playing a part. She looked like herself. Afterward, standing in the afternoon light outside the small building where the ceremony had taken place, she said to him quietly, "That's done." "It is," he said. "Don't look so relieved," she said. "I'm not relieved," he said. "I'm just settled." She looked at him sideways. "That's a better word," she said. "Was." The years that followed were not simple. No years are, when the work is real. The first full year under the Fitch contract pushed both of them harder than either had expected. The second delivery had a quality issue, not with Evelyn's work, but with a batch of raw hides she'd sourced from a new supplier who had misrepresented the preparation. She caught it before the pieces were finished, rejected the entire batch, and went back to her established suppliers at higher cost, and a 2-week delay she'd had to explain to Fitch directly. She wrote the letter to Fitch herself. She told him the truth, the source, the problem, the decision to reject and restart. She didn't apologize for the delay. She explained it. Fitch wrote back, "Your transparency is noted and respected. Timeline adjustment accepted." "He respects you more for that than if it had gone smoothly," Silas told her. "I know," she said, "but it still cost me 2 weeks and $300 in material." "Yes," he said, "both things are true." She looked at him. "You've said that before." "It keeps being true," he said. She shook her head, but there was something in it that wasn't irritation. The trading post expanded the following year. A new supply arrangement with a wholesaler in Millfield that improved Silas's margins and allowed him to extend credit to homesteaders on terms that the previous arrangement hadn't permitted. He hired a clerk, a young man named Davis, who was methodical and honest and who handled the daily inventory with enough competence to free Silas for the larger commercial relationships that were now the real work of the business. Davis, within his first 6 months, developed the particular expression that new employees develop when they begin to understand the actual dynamic of the operation they've joined. He had arrived expecting to work for a merchant. He had discovered he worked for 2 people who happened to run connected businesses and who argued on a Tuesday afternoon about the correct approach to a contract renegotiation with a tone that suggested they had argued before and would argue again and considered it a normal part of existing in the same professional world. "They're not like I expected," he told his mother on a visit home. "They don't fit together the way married people usually fit, but they work." His mother, who had been alive long enough to know that this was actually the description of most functional partnerships that weren't performing for an audience, told him that was probably the best kind. Their first son was born in the winter of 1884. They named him Thomas, which Silas had suggested. Evelyn had looked at him when he said it, a long look, measuring what it meant that he would offer that without being asked. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "It's the right name." She'd looked away then, and he'd seen her jaw tighten in the way it did when she was containing something large. "Yes," she'd said after a moment, "it is." Thomas Mercer was a difficult infant who became an easy child, stubborn, curious, physically capable in the way of children who spend their early years in a place that requires attention and respect for the physical world. He followed his mother around the workroom from the time he could walk, watching her hands with the focused attention of someone who understands, even very young, that what they are watching is worth understanding. The second son, James, came 2 years later. He was his father's temperament, quieter, more observant, the kind of child who listened to conversations from the edge of the room and synthesized them privately before speaking. He had Silas's memory for numbers, and Evelyn's unforgiving eye for whether a thing was done correctly. Neither boy grew up soft. The frontier didn't permit it, and their parents wouldn't have known how to produce it anyway. They grew up understanding that work was the primary language of the world they lived in, not as punishment, but as the basic grammar of being a person who wanted to stand on their own ground. What they also grew up understanding, because it was simply the air of the house they lived in, was that two people could be genuinely different and genuinely equal simultaneously. They watched their father defer to their mother on decisions about the leather operation without any apparent cost to his dignity. They watched their mother listen to their father's business judgment without pretending she wasn't sometimes annoyed by it. They watched two people argue and not perform the argument for an audience and come to conclusions that neither of them had arrived at alone. This was not a lesson that was taught. It was just what they saw. The leather operation became Hartwell Goods by 1887. The name was Evelyn's decision and Silas's suggestion simultaneously. He'd said one evening that the work had always been hers in a way that his name would obscure, and she'd looked at him for a moment and then written the name on a piece of paper and looked at it. "It sounds like something that lasts," she said. "It does," he agreed. Hartwell Goods supplied to Fitch's firm for 11 continuous years. In that time, Evelyn hired 3 skilled workers: a young woman from a homestead north of Miller's Creek who had learned leather work from her father and had nowhere to apply it, a man who had worked in a commercial tannery in Ohio and had come west for reasons he didn't explain and didn't need to, and eventually Thomas, who started as a weekend helper at 14 and had by 17 a technical skill that surpassed everyone in the operation except his mother. The expansion of the physical operation happened in stages, each one paid for before the next was started. Evelyn had a constitutional resistance to debt that Silas respected even when it slowed things, because he understood it came from the same place as everything else about her. The understanding that what you owned outright was what you actually owned. She'd learned that in the years after Thomas's death, when the homestead had been the only thing standing between her and a return to a life she'd left. She made mistakes. The supplier decision in the first year was not the last one. She misjudged a market shift in 1888 that resulted in 12 pieces produced to a specification that the buyer subsequently changed. And she ate the cost and learned the lesson about building more flexibility into contracts with volatile buyers. There was a season when she pushed the production pace past what her workers could sustain without error, and the error rate climbed, and she had to stop and look honestly at what she'd done and correct it, which required admitting to herself that the growth had outrun her management. "You're going too fast," Silas told her that year. "I know," she said, which was hard for her to say. "The revenue will still be there when you slow down," he said. "Quality is what keeps Fitch." "I know that too," she said. "Stop being right." "I'll try," he said. "You never do," she said. But she slowed down. They had arguments that mattered, about the business direction, about money, about how much risk was acceptable, and who got to decide. Some of the arguments took days to resolve. Some of them didn't resolve cleanly, and both of them knew it and moved on anyway, carrying the unresolved part with a pragmatism that was probably the most honest thing about them. What they didn't do, in any of the arguments, was make the argument about who was in charge. That question had been settled on a Wednesday afternoon in February 1883 in a trading post at the north end of a frontier settlement, without drama and without a ceremony. It didn't need to be resettled. Redemption Hollow grew around them. It grew the way frontier settlements grew when they survived long enough. Not all at once, but steadily. The economy thickening as more families came and stayed and built. A schoolhouse appeared in 1886, built by community subscription, which Silas organized and Evelyn contributed to materially, and neither of them made speeches about. A second general store opened in 1889, which was competition for Silas, and which he handled by improving his supply chain rather than complaining about it. Francis Alcott's Hotel became a proper establishment with a dining room that served 3 meals. Gabe Hollister's blacksmith operation expanded to include a machine shop, which he ran with his son. The doctor, who was also the dentist, was joined by an actual dentist, which the doctor considered a personal affront. The community that had questioned Evelyn's right to operate on her own terms became, over the years, a community that simply incorporated her as part of its landscape, the way towns incorporate everything that proves durable. The women who had found her strange in 1882 found her less strange by 1887, partly because she was successful enough that the strangeness had been reclassified as character, and partly because several of their own daughters had started quietly to want the kind of life she demonstrated was possible. She was not a reformer. She didn't give speeches. She didn't tell other women how to live. She just lived the way she lived, visibly and without apology, and that was its own kind of argument. The 2 boys grew. Thomas at 20 had his mother's hands and his father's patience, and he took over the primary operations of Hartwell Goods with a competence that freed Evelyn to do what she'd never had time for: the experimental work, the craft development, the pieces that weren't for the Fitch contract but were simply the furthest edge of what she knew how to do. James went east at 18 to study commerce and came back at 22 with a vocabulary that sometimes annoyed his mother and an understanding of markets that sometimes impressed his father. He joined the trading post operation and transformed the supply chain in ways that Silas, who was honest about his own limitations, acknowledged were better than what he would have built. These were not perfect sons. Thomas had his mother's stubbornness without always having her self-awareness, and there were years when they clashed in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary. James had his father's tendency to recede when he should have spoken, and Evelyn spent years pushing him to say the difficult thing rather than think it quietly and move on. They both made mistakes that cost real things: money, time, relationships. They both learned from some of them and repeated others. That was what people did. In the spring of 1901, almost 20 years after a woman had walked into a trading post with 7 pelts and the bearing of someone who expected to be dismissed and had decided not to care, Silas and Evelyn sat on the porch of the homestead that was larger now than it had ever been and watched the late afternoon come across the property. He was 54. She was 53. Neither of them was what they'd been at 35. His hair was fully gray and he had a bad knee from a fall 3 winters back, and she had lines at her eyes and a shoulder that ached in cold weather from an old strain she'd never fully rested because she didn't know how to fully rest. They were worn the way things are worn that have been used seriously. The creek was audible from where they sat. The tree line to the north was the same tree line it had always been. James wants to expand the trading post into Millfield, Silas said. He's been working up to asking me about it for a month. I know, she said. He asked me what I thought first. Silas looked at her. What did you tell him? I told him to ask you. It's your business to pass on. She paused. And I told him that if he's going to do it, he should own it completely or not do it at all. No, halfway. Silas was quiet for a moment. That sounds familiar. It should, she said. The light was doing what it did in the late afternoon on that particular piece of ground, coming in low and flat from the west, catching the tops of the grasses in the near meadow in a way that made them look like they were lit from inside. Do you regret any of it? He asked. It wasn't a question he'd asked before, in 20 years. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, seriously, without performance. The supplier mistake in 85, she said. I should have caught that sooner, and the season I pushed too hard. I hurt people who depended on me by not seeing clearly. She paused. Those things I regret. I meant more broadly. I know what you meant. She looked at the meadow. No, not broadly. Another pause. I miss Thomas sometimes. That doesn't go away. But it's not a regret. It's just grief. And grief is just the shape love takes when the person isn't there anymore. He said nothing. He'd learned, over 20 years, when silence was the right answer. You? She said. He thought about it. I regret the years before you walked in, he said. I was here, and I was working, and I told myself that was enough. It wasn't. I just didn't know what else there was. She looked at him sideways. 7 pelts changed that. 7 extraordinary pelts, he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, the closest thing to a laugh she'd ever consistently produced, which was still quieter than most people's, but which he'd been hearing for 20 years and considered one of the finer sounds in his experience. They sat in silence for a while after that. The afternoon moved the way afternoons move on open land, slowly, with room in it. What he thought about, sitting there, was not the business or the contract or the arguments or the hard seasons. He thought about a woman who had refused to be diminished by a world that found her inconvenient, who had built something real with her own hands and on her own terms, and who had chosen, at the end of it all, not to do it entirely alone. Not because she needed saving, but because she had decided that a life shared with someone worthy of it was not a compromise but an expansion. He thought about what it meant to respect someone completely. Not the idea of them, not the version of them you needed them to be, but the actual complicated, specific person, flaws and stubbornness and the bad shoulder and the way she was still, after 20 years, somewhat difficult to wake up in the morning, and the way she could be wrong and know it and say so without making a production of it, and the way her hands moved when she was working on something that mattered, and the way she'd held his hand across a kitchen table in April of 1883 and not said anything else because there wasn't anything else to say. He thought about the 7 pelts on the counter. He thought about the kind of space. The thing about building a life with someone, the real thing, not the story of it, is that it doesn't look like what you imagine when you're young. It isn't a single moment or a grand gesture or a clean arc with a beginning and an end. It's accumulated Tuesday mornings. It's arguments that don't resolve and work that doesn't stop, and 2 people who have decided again and again in the ordinary middle of ordinary days that the other person is worth the difficulty of genuine presence. What Silas Mercer understood, sitting on a porch in the spring of 1901 with his bad knee and his gray hair, and the woman who had never been what the world expected and had never apologized for it, was that the greatest thing you could offer another person was not protection or provision or even love in the abstract sense of the word. It was attention. Real, sustained, demanding, unsentimental attention. The decision to see someone clearly and stay anyway. The refusal to ask them to be smaller than they were for the sake of your own comfort. Evelyn had asked him once, in the early years, not to make promises he didn't mean. He hadn't. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not the contract, not the business, not the expansion, not the 2 sons or the community that had been reshaped by the presence of people who did things differently. Not the legacy, which was real, but was also just what happened when you lived with integrity long enough that it accumulated. The whole of it was simpler than any of that. A man who paid attention, a woman who refused to disappear, and the decision made more than once in the face of inconvenience and judgment and the ordinary grinding difficulty of real life to build something true. Outside the trading post, 20 years ago, 7 pelts had sat on a counter and waited to go somewhere. They had gone further than either of them could have mapped. The creek ran on. The light moved. The spring evening came in quietly, the way evenings do in country that has seen enough of human effort to be patient about it. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. They didn't need to.